Chat guys, welcome to this ITBG Multimedia Studios tutorial. My name is Thomas Robb. This will be part one of a two-part tutorial series on Introduction to Sculpting. In this part we'll be going over different ways of subdividing a mesh to get it to a spot where we can actually sculpt on it. So, default file here. If you just quickly go into Sculpt Mode by coming down here to the options, go to Sculpt Mode. You'll notice a few things. We have another panel over here and we have a brush. Now if we try to sculpt on this cube, it's not very satisfying. You see that it just kind of makes it warp, and it's kind of strange. It's not really what you would expect to be, to be happening. So I'm going to go back to object mode and try to explain this. So if we tab into edit mode, we look at this cube. It has 8 vertices, so each one of these points is a vertex. It has 8 of these connected by edges which make up faces. Now Sculpt Mode, or Sculpting, takes those, it's the same principle as box modeling. And box modeling, you extrude a vertex and then you select edges and you fill them, and that's how you end up creating shapes, is by filling in between edges and making vertices. So that's how you create shapes in box modeling, which is pretty straightforward. But sculpting, it's actually very similar. Basically, you only are able to sculpt with the amount of vertices that you have on an object. So that's why when we go into sculpt mode and you try to sculpt on this, it is only grabbing the vertex that you're hovering over and moving it. It's not doing what you would expect, like making trails, or what you see this brush doing over here on the preview is not what we're seeing here. And that's because we only have 8 vertices on this cube. So let's switch back to object mode, and we're going to delete this cube by hitting X and then delete. And I'm actually going to delete the rest of these objects in the scene by hitting A to select all the objects in the scene and just hitting X to delete. And I'm going to hit Shift A and mesh. We're going to add a UV sphere. We're going to see what Sculpt Mode does on this. So we're going to switch to Sculpt Mode, and already you start to see that it's a little bit easier to tell what's going on. I mean, we can get some basic shapes out of it, but still it's not as satisfactory as you'd like. But this really brings out the point I was making with the last object, and that is that only the vertices that are inside the object or are making up the object can be modified in Sculpt Mode. So now that we have that pretty firmly planted in our mind, I'm going to remove this by hitting X and delete and adding back a cube again. And so how we get around this, there's actually a couple ways of doing this. When we switch to, well, I'll go the other way first. The first way is going to be by using a modifier. And there's a couple different modifiers we can use for this. We can use a subdivision surface modifier, which if we add that, you'll instantly see what effect that has. It is basically smoothing out the cube, and the more subdivisions we add over here in this bar, you can see the smoother and smoother it gets, and the more vertices it adds. So if we look up here, we have 8 vertices and 6 faces and 12 triangles. And I'll talk about the triangles later, but right now we're mainly focusing on the vertices and faces. So we have 8 vertices in this cube. If we bump up the resolution of the subsurface modifier, you'll see it jumps to 26 vertices. And we go to 3, 98 vertices. So you see how we have a lot more to work with now. So we could bump this all the way up to like something like 10, and you'll want to be careful about this, because you'll instantly see my computer, which is really good, start really slowing down. So you want to be careful about how many subdivisions you add on a subdivision surface modifier. So let's set that back to 2 and hit apply. And now if we hit tab to go into edit mode on our cube, you can see that we now have a lot more vertices to work with, but that's still nowhere near enough for what we're trying to go for. So what we can do is we can add another subdivision surface modifier and just start bumping up those, and basically you just get the idea. You just keep adding more and more. And I would actually stay away from this method. It is a method, I've seen people use it, but I find it's very messy in the end, and so I would recommend staying away from it. So let's hit X and delete and add in a brand new cube again. And the way that I would suggest doing is using a multi-resolution modifier. Now, it looks pretty strange. It's got a lot of buttons here, but it's pretty simple. And so let's just quickly do an overview. It's similar to the subdivision surface modifier. If we click subdivide, it'll do the exact same thing as a subdivision surface. And we can start, the more times you click subdivide, the more times you'll be able to see it subdivide. And we have a preview, we have a sculpt, and we have a render. And so this is the render resolution, which is going to be the full 5, which is the max that we've subdivided this cube to. The sculpt is going to be 5, which is also the max. So when we're sculpting, we have the vertices that 5 subdivisions would give us to work with. And then the preview is also a different swatch, and that's just to show you what it's looking like when you're just rotating around the 3D view. So once you start getting into super highly detailed models that you have 10 or even 12 subdivision or layers on it, you'll want the preview down to like 2 or 3. Actually, you'll want the preview down to 2 or 3, and the sculpt, at your highest, and also the render. So that gives you a lot more freedom. But let's just quickly jump into sculpt mode here, and if we just start sculpting, you'll instantly see that we're able to do a lot more now. I mean, this is starting to look more like what you would expect in sculpting. To a point. I mean, you still see some hard edges here, but still, I mean, that's much better. And I would be very careful, like I said in the past, how many subdivisions you add. Especially with the multi-resolution modifier, it can add up very quickly. I mean, you can already tell we're already up to 24,578 vertices on a single cube. And now, granted, that's pretty low for a highly detailed sculpted model. But for this stage of just rough sculpting, you don't want too many, because you need to sculpt in layers. You need to sculpt the base, then you need to sculpt a little bit higher detail and just sculpt up. That's how you sculpt. You can't just sculpt super fine details way in here and then zoom way out and sculpt big ones right along the side. So anyway, that's the multi-resolution modifier. So let's jump back into object mode and delete this object. We're going to add in another cube yet again, and this is the final way of doing it. So this way is very cool, and there are a few downsides to this. Using the multi-resolution modifier, you can modify the mesh at a base level of any level you want. Let's see if I can get that one back. So right now, if we jump into edit mode, we're modifying this cube at the very base level, no subdivisions. If we drag this vertice way over here, you'll instantly see what the effect it has on our sculpted model. So that could be extremely useful. Now this other way is also very useful, but in a different way. Because if we go into sculpt mode and we come over here and enable Dynotop, which means dynamic topology, we can now sculpt on our cube, and it creates pseudo vertices, or not pseudo, but it creates basically fake vertices that we can use on our mesh that aren't there normally. It actually subdivides our cube only in the places that we've sculpted. So that can be a memory saver in a way, which is really cool. So why don't we go into object mode and tab into edit mode? Suddenly you'll see this mess, and it is. And dynamic topology will leave a very messy object behind, whereas a subdivision surface or a multi-resolution modifier won't leave this messy of a surface. But the cool thing about dynamic topology is that it creates the vertices on the fly, and you can get a much more smooth result in the end, especially if you start pumping up the detail down to like 5, which is as high as I would recommend. And So instead of using subdivide collapse, you could use subdivide edges as well, and you'll start getting a much finer result to your sculpting than you would with a multi-resolution. So those are all things. I use them all in conjunction with each other. So it's an important thing to be able to know all of the different methods so that you can be able to use them wisely. And again, it's the same thing with anything in Blender. Bumping up the resolution, it'll look a lot nicer, but it will also eat up your memory. And so just always be careful. Know your computer, know its limits. I would say before you start sculpting on a really important project, just try bumping up all of the settings as high as they will go, just to see how far your computer will let you push, so that way you're not pushing it on a project that you want to save and then have it quit on you and you lose work, and that's no fun, believe me. So push your computer to the limits on test subjects. That way when you do it in real time on a real important project, you know how far you can go. So anyway, that will conclude this tutorial. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.